Picture this. You are one of the most powerful men in the empire. Your family's name etched into the marble of Rome's history. Your every step watched with respect and envy. Tonight, you've been summoned to dine with the emperor himself, an honor so rare it should fill you with pride. But as you ascend the gleaming marble steps of the Palatine Hill, pride gives way to a deep, gut-twisting dread. The guards at the gates avert their eyes. The air inside is heavy, scented with expensive incense that cannot hide something else entirely, the unspoken terror of those who know what happens here after the wine is poured. And then, from the shadowed corridor, comes a sound that freezes your blood. Footsteps and laughter. The emperor has arrived, and tonight his palace will not be a court of politics, but a theatre of lust, humiliation, and control. This is the story of the emperor who turned the heart of Rome into a den of orgies. Imagine yourself as a distinguished Roman senator, a man whose lineage stretches back to the Republic's proudest days, whose ancestors stood beside generals in triumphal processions, whose name carries the weight of centuries. You have given decades to the service of Rome, in debate, in diplomacy, in the quiet negotiations that hold the empire together. Your toga, edged with the imperial purple stripe, is more than a garment. It is the mark of a lifetime's loyalty. Tonight, that loyalty has been recognized. A gilded tablet has been delivered to your home, its polished surface etched with the emperor's seal. You have been summoned to dine at the palace, the greatest honor any man in the empire can receive. In another time, such an invitation would have filled you with pride. But as you step from your litter and begin the climb toward the Palatine Hill, the familiar pride is absent. In its place grows a cold, gnawing apprehension. The marble steps leading to the palace gleam in the torchlight, but each one feels heavier than the last. The Praetorian guards at the entrance are motionless, their faces rigid, their eyes fixed on nothing at all. You know these men. Some have fought beside you in campaigns past, yet tonight not one will meet your gaze. Their silence is not the courtesy of discipline, it is the silence of men who have seen too much. Even the air feels unnatural. Expensive incense curls upward from golden braziers, perfuming the corridor with frankincense and myrrh. But beneath that sweetness lingers a smell you cannot name, something warmer, human, almost animal. It is not the scent of death, but it belongs to the same family. You pass into the great hall, where the most exalted of Rome's citizens have gathered, senators in their finest togas, generals polished with victory and gold, the wives and daughters of noble families glittering with jewels. Yet for all this splendor, there is no laughter, no idle chatter. People stand in small, tense clusters, speaking in low voices, eyes flickering constantly toward the archway at the far end of the hall. The air itself seems to be holding its breath. You feel it in your chest. This strange collective anticipation, and though you cannot name it, you recognize its source. Fear. And then it comes. The sound that cleaves through the murmurs like a blade, measured footsteps on marble, each one echoing sharply in the vaulted space. Interwoven with them is a sound wholly out of place. Laughter. Not the warm laughter of a friend reunited, but something higher, sharper, tinged with madness. The conversation dies entirely. All heads turn toward the archway as the emperor enters. He is dressed in silk that flows like molten gold, the fabric shifting with the movement of his body so that he seems almost to glow. Jewels flash at his wrists and throat, catching the light with every gesture. But it is not his clothing that captures you, it is his eyes, bright, unblinking, predatory. He surveys the room not as a host greeting his guests, but as a hunter measuring the strength of the animals in his pen. A slow, deliberate smile curves his lips. When he speaks, his voice fills the space without effort, rich and musical. yet carrying something darker beneath. "My friends," he says, spreading his arms as though to embrace the entire assembly, "tonight I wish to know who among you loves me most. Tonight we will learn the measure of loyalty." The words hang in the air, at once inviting and threatening. You do not yet understand what he means, but you know, as every soul in the room knows, that this evening will not be one of polite toasts and political conversation. The palace, for all its marble and gold, has been remade into something else entirely. It will be a place where boundaries dissolve, where dignity is unmade, where the emperor's will is the only law. To understand how Rome's most sacred seat of power could be twisted into a theatre of indulgence and humiliation, you must first know the man who commands it. Born Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus in the year 12 CE, he was the beloved son of Germanicus, the empire's golden general, whose victories had been celebrated in every corner of Rome. As a child, Gaius travelled with his father on military campaigns, dressed in a tiny soldier's uniform that charmed the hardened legions. It was this costume that earned him the nickname the world would remember, Caligula Little Boots. But the sweetness of that image belied the reality of his youth. By the time he was 7, the boy who played at war had seen what it truly meant to live and die in the imperial household. His father's sudden death, whispered to be the result of poison ordered by Emperor Tiberius, shattered whatever safety childhood might have offered. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, and his brothers were soon drawn into the deadly machinery of imperial politics, exile, imprisonment, and quiet execution. Caligula learned quickly that in Rome's highest circles, love was as dangerous as hate, and loyalty was a coin spent recklessly. In that world, survival meant never showing weakness, never revealing the smallest crack in the armor. He became a master of the performance, presenting himself as harmless, even affable, while absorbing each blow the world dealt him. Behind the mask, the boy hardened. When Tiberius died in 37 CE, the Senate and people of Rome rejoiced to see the 24-year-old Caligula take the throne. Here, at last, was the heir of Germanicus, young, charismatic, and untainted by the paranoia that had poisoned the old emperor's reign. The city celebrated. Political exiles were recalled, lavish games held, generous gifts bestowed upon the Praetorian Guard. For 7 months it seemed Rome had been reborn. But then came the sickness. Accounts vary, but ancient writers agree that late in that first year, Caligula was struck by a sudden and terrible illness. For days he drifted on the edge of death while the empire held its breath. Some say it was a fever that attacked the brain, others believe it stripped away the last fragile layers of restraint that had kept darker impulses at bay. Whatever the cause, when the emperor recovered, those closest to him knew something essential had changed. The bright young ruler was gone. In his place stood a man who no longer recognized boundaries between the sacred and the profane, the permissible and the obscene. At first, the transformation was subtle. Lavish spending, erratic decisions, a growing taste for spectacle. But behind the palace doors, the change was far more alarming. The emperor had discovered something during his brush with death, that as ruler of Rome he could do anything to anyone without consequence. No law constrained him, no man could deny him. And in that realization lay the seed of what the palace would become. The first to feel the shift were the palace servants, men and women who had long served the imperial family without incident. Now they found themselves summoned at strange hours to fulfill the emperor's whims, many of them of a deeply personal nature. Young male attendants were drawn into his private chambers and subjected to acts that violated every Roman sense of decorum. Female servants fared no better. Some were pulled from their duties in the dead of night to satisfy the emperor's appetites, their protests silenced by the knowledge that refusal was as good as a death sentence. From the servants, the pattern extended outward to senators' wives, to the daughters of Rome's most respected families. Invitations to the palace, once marks of honor, became traps from which no polite excuse could free you. Within these marble halls, status offered no protection. The emperor had begun to wield sex not as pleasure, but as a weapon, a means of control, a tool for breaking spirits and asserting that no one in Rome, not even its noblest blood, was beyond his reach. And this was only the beginning. The first signs of what the palace was becoming were barely noticed outside its walls. At court, the emperor still held audiences, still signed decrees, still presided over the rituals that gave the illusion of order. But in the quiet hours, away from the Senate's gaze, his appetites began to bend the rhythms of the palace towards something far more dangerous. The marble corridors, once the passageways of imperial business, became hunting grounds. Servants moved with the cautious silence of prey. The rustle of silk behind you could mean an order to attend the emperor, and no one returned from such summonses unchanged. Those who tried to speak of what was happening quickly learned that even whispers could reach ears loyal to the throne, and that a word too many could see one's body dumped in the Tiber before morning. At first, the emperor's demands were directed toward those beneath notice. The young pages who poured wine at banquets, the kitchen girls, the foreign slaves whose faces Rome would not recognize. They were taken in small numbers, chosen at random, their bodies made to serve as proof that no one in the palace lived beyond the emperor's reach. But the satisfaction this gave him was fleeting. Soon his attention drifted toward the wives and daughters of senators, generals, and wealthy merchants. An invitation to a private audience began to carry a meaning that no polite Roman could speak aloud. It might arrive as a neatly written note in imperial script or a simple message carried by a palace guard. Either way, the recipient knew its unspoken demand and the cost of refusal. The emperor's skill was in dressing his cruelty as a test of devotion. In those early months, the invitations were framed as opportunities to discuss matters of the household, to share the emperor's table, to honor him with one's company. But once behind the carved cedar doors of his private chambers, pretense was abandoned. Women were commanded to strip, to kneel, to perform acts that the codes of Roman aristocracy considered not only shameful but unthinkable. These were not nights of mutual pleasure. They were demonstrations of power, acts calculated to humiliate and to strip away every layer of dignity the victim possessed. And always there was an audience, whether it was the emperor's own attendants, fellow nobles, or the woman's own husband, forced to watch in silence as his wife became a spectacle for the ruler's amusement. It was not long before these encounters bled into the public life of the palace. Formal dinners became carefully staged performances. The emperor would open with the usual pleasantries, praising the season's harvest, inquiring after the health of a senator's household. And then, as wine flowed and music swelled, his voice would turn sharp with insinuation. A compliment on a woman's beauty might turn into a command for her to rise, to display herself, to cross the room and kneel before him. He might call for her husband to stand beside him and describe, in humiliating detail, what he intended to do to her. Refusal was unthinkable. Survival depended on compliance. The gatherings that began as banquets began to shift, slowly but inexorably, into something darker. Couches were rearranged to form a circle, allowing every guest a clear view of what happened in the center. The emperor would bring forth one of his chosen women, sometimes a wife fresh from her wedding night, sometimes a matron whose lineage traced to the founders of Rome, and order her to perform for the assembly. Sometimes he took part himself. Other times he lounged like a stage director, offering cruel commentary, directing the pace, summoning others to join. In this way, the palace began to transform, its grand reception rooms doubling as stages for carefully choreographed displays of submission. But the emperor's genius for control went beyond the acts themselves. He understood that the greatest humiliation was not simply to be degraded, but to be made complicit in the degradation of others. Husbands were ordered to prepare their wives for the emperor's use, to escort them into the chamber, to undress them with their own hands. Fathers were commanded to present their daughters. Brothers were told to hold their sisters still when they resisted. Each act burned the bonds of family into ash, leaving behind only shame and the knowledge that they had helped to destroy those they loved. In a city where a man's honour was bound to the virtue of his household, this was a form of execution without blood. Within months, the palace itself began to change. Rooms were refurbished for the emperor's purposes, not the discreet, perfumed chambers of lovers, but elaborate stages designed for spectacle. Couches were placed in concentric circles around open floors, raised platforms allowed for viewing from multiple angles, balconies offered high vantage points for those the emperor wished to honor with a superior view. Every detail was engineered to make the acts performed within them as public and as inescapable as possible. The architecture itself became an accomplice to the humiliation it contained. As the emperor's hunger for control deepened, the boundaries between the political, the religious, and the sexual dissolved entirely. Formal meetings of the Senate might be interrupted by the arrival of women, the wives of the men present, ordered to serve the emperor in ways that had nothing to do with politics. Religious ceremonies, once conducted with solemn dignity, became excuses for ritualized debauchery, the emperor presiding like a god over rites that mixed the sacred with the obscene. Priestesses sworn to chastity were commanded to break their vows in public, their bodies offered as tributes not to the gods of Rome, but to the man who claimed to be divine himself. And still, it was not enough. The emperor began to bring this new order beyond the palace walls. When foreign dignitaries visited, they were not shown the libraries or the military drills. They were escorted into the emperor's inner halls to witness, or to participate in, the displays he had made the centerpiece of his reign. The humiliation of Rome's own elite was a gift he offered to the watching world, proof that his power was absolute, that he could unmake the very families who had once guarded the empire's foundations. In doing so, he was not only indulging his appetites, he was dismantling the social order that had kept Rome's governing class intact for centuries. By the time the first year of his reign had passed, the palace was no longer simply a seat of government. It was a labyrinth of performance spaces, private chambers, and ritual halls, a living monument to the emperor's philosophy that power meant the right to take, to command, to destroy at will. For those who lived within its walls, it was a place without day or night, where a summons could come at any hour, where music and laughter were masks stretched thin over the sound of sobs, where the torchlight glinted on marble floors that had borne witness to acts no historian could ever record in full. The transformation was complete. Rome's heart no longer beat for law, for religion, or for the Senate. It beat to the rhythm of the emperor's desires, and this was only the palace's first rebirth. The excesses yet to come would make even these early degradations seem almost tame. By the second year of his reign, there was no longer any need for subtlety. The emperor's private indulgences had swelled into full-scale productions, and the palace itself operated like a theatre dedicated entirely to the display of submission. The line between guest and captive blurred. Once you stepped across the threshold, your fate belonged to the ruler's whim. Invitations to the palace still arrived gilded and formal, but they were no longer honours. They were warnings written in gold. No senator, no general, no noble family could refuse them. The price of absence was ruin. The price of presence was surrender. The emperor had refined his use of the palace into something almost ceremonial. Nights began in the grand hall, the guests dressed in their finest, the air rich with the scent of spiced wine and roasting meats. The first hour passed with music, dancing, and conversation, lulling the assembly into a false sense of safety. Then the shift came, subtle at first, then undeniable. The musicians changed their tune to something slower, heavier, The torches were dimmed until the marble gleamed in amber shadow. From his elevated seat, the emperor would rise and let the silence gather around him like a cloak. And then, in a voice soft enough to make every guest strain to hear, he would name his first subject for the night. Sometimes it was the wife of a senator seated in the front row. Sometimes it was a daughter barely past her marriage age. Occasionally it was a man, a general whose victories had made him too popular, or a merchant whose wealth tempted the treasury. Whoever it was, they were summoned into the open space at the centre of the hall, and from there the evening's performance would unfold. Acts that should have been private or never have happened at all became spectacles watched by dozens, sometimes hundreds, of Rome's most powerful figures. The emperor did not simply take pleasure, he orchestrated, demanding specific movements, pairing strangers together, forcing families into impossible choices that left them hollow-eyed and broken. He found special satisfaction in drawing husbands and fathers into the cruelty. A man might be ordered to strip his own wife, to instruct her on how to please the ruler, to hold her in place if she faltered. Refusal was not defiance, it was suicide. Those who hesitated were reminded of their children's safety, or the lands and fortunes that could vanish overnight with a stroke of the emperor's pen. And so, with trembling hands and a face carved from stone, a man would participate in his own disgrace, becoming an accomplice to the violation of his blood. In the emperor's eyes, this was the purest demonstration of power, not simply to break someone, but to make them help in the breaking. The palace's architecture was no longer merely grand, it was complicit. New chambers had been constructed with raised seating arranged in tiers, ensuring that every act was visible from every angle. The walls were adorned not with the marble friezes of Rome's heroes, but with frescoes and mosaics depicting scenes that blurred myth, religion, and carnal indulgence. The imagery was not subtle. It reinforced the message that what happened here was sanctioned not just by imperial authority, but by the gods themselves, or at least by the god the emperor claimed to be. At the centre of this transformation was what the court came to call the inner circle, a vast room with a sunken floor and a wide cushioned dais in its heart. Here the emperor staged the most elaborate of his spectacles, surrounding himself with courtiers, guards, and hand-picked guests. The air was thick with incense and heated oils. The sound of silk sliding against skin became as common as the clink of goblets. From hidden corridors, attendants brought forth those who would serve in the night's entertainment. Noblewomen whose families had displeased the emperor, prisoners from conquered territories, even slaves chosen for their beauty or strength. The performances were carefully arranged, so that the most humiliating moments occurred under the eyes of those whose respect the victims could never regain. What made these nights so destructive was not only the violation itself, but the way the emperor wove them into the fabric of political life. A man who had been forced to deliver his daughter into the inner circle could never again stand in the Senate without feeling the eyes of his peers upon him, knowing they had seen his family's shame. A woman who had been compelled to perform for the court could never walk through the forum without hearing whispers. The humiliation became a kind of living brand, carried everywhere, impossible to hide. In this way, the emperor extended the reach of his control far beyond the palace walls. Every noble house became a prisoner of its own disgrace. The most disturbing innovation came when the emperor began linking these spectacles with the empire's most sacred rites. Traditional festivals, once marked by solemn processions and public feasts, were reimagined as excuses for massive gatherings inside the palace. Religious sacrifices were accompanied by scenes of ritualized debasement, the boundaries between worship and submission deliberately erased. Priestesses sworn to purity were commanded to join the performances, their vows shattered before the eyes of gods and men alike. In this way, the emperor rewrote not only the customs of the court, but the moral code of the empire itself. By now, The palace was no longer a seat of governance at all. It was a functioning organism, its every corridor and chamber devoted to feeding the emperor's appetite for dominance. Servants no longer served, they scouted, they fetched, they prepared victims for presentation. Guards did not simply protect, they enforced the new order, dragging the reluctant from their chambers, ensuring no one slipped away before their turn came. Even the musicians and entertainers were drawn into the cycle, their performances choreographed to accompany each stage of the night's degradation. And still, the emperor pushed further. If one night's spectacle did not satisfy him, he would command that the same participants return the next evening, and the one after, until their resistance dissolved into numb compliance. Families learned to dread the sound of footsteps outside their doors, the sudden knock that meant another summons had arrived. In the emperor's design there was no end to the performance, only the rotation of roles. One night you might be in the centre of the room, the next you might be in the tiers above, forced to applaud as others endured what you had suffered. By the height of his rule, the transformation was complete. The palace was a city within a city, a self-contained world where Rome's laws did not exist, where honour was currency to be stripped from you and paraded for all to see. And in the heart of this gilded prison sat the man who had turned it into a den of orgies, not merely for his own pleasure, but as the purest expression of what he believed. Power to be, the right to own every body, every will, every breath in his empire. By the midpoint of his reign, the emperor's appetites had evolved beyond impulsive indulgence. The palace no longer operated on whim alone, it had become a system, an institution with rules known only to those within its marble walls. What began as evenings of private degradation had been refined into a calendar of events, each more elaborate than the last. Certain days of the week were marked for private devotion, smaller, tightly controlled spectacles in the inner chambers. Others were reserved for public loyalty, vast gatherings in which the city's elite were summoned en masse to watch, participate, and remember. There was no mistaking the purpose. This was no longer about pleasure in any human sense, but about reshaping the social order of Rome into a hierarchy where every person's worth was measured by their willingness to submit. The most effective weapon in the emperor's arsenal was the merging of this sexual theatre with the empire's sacred rites. Rome's religion, rooted in centuries of tradition, was based on the idea that public ritual preserved the favour of the gods. The emperor twisted this foundation until it served him alone. In his new vision, the gods themselves demanded these performances. And he, as their living embodiment, was the vessel through which devotion must be shown. Sacrifices in the temples were no longer enough. Now, the true offering was the body, a senator's wife kneeling in the inner circle during a feast dedicated to Jupiter, a priestess stripped of her sacred robes to dance at the emperor's command, a noble family's daughters ordered to serve wine naked at a festival in honor of Venus. It was not framed as humiliation, it was framed as piety. The emperor's rhetoric was calculated, spoken in a voice that carried both the weight of law and the smoothness of seduction. If the gods have blessed you with beauty, he would say to his chosen victims, to deny it to their living representative is to deny it to them. In this way, resistance became not only political defiance, but religious sacrilege, an act punishable not just by the emperor's wrath, but by the judgment of heaven. The reach of this new order extended far beyond the marble gates of the Palatine Hill. Provincial governors, eager to prove their loyalty, began to replicate the system in miniature within their own territories. Reports arrived in Rome describing smaller courts staging similar rituals, their participants drawn from local elites. The emperor rewarded these imitations lavishly, creating a competition among his subordinates to produce the most elaborate displays. The network of imperial debauchery became an empire-wide chain of humiliation, linking the farthest provinces to the palace at its heart. At home, the emperor developed an even more insidious form of control, a taxation system built on sexual service. Wealthy families were assessed not only in coin but in flesh. The levy was calculated according to status. The higher the rank, the more service days owed to the emperor's palace each year. These women, and sometimes men, were scheduled into the spectacles like performers in a theatre, their roles and partners determined by the emperor himself. There was no appeal, no negotiation. Those who attempted to bribe their way out found the penalty swift and merciless: confiscation of property, public disgrace, or execution. Even the wealthiest patrician could be reduced to ruin overnight for failing to meet their obligation. The palace corridors began to echo with new sounds: the shuffle of reluctant feet being led to the chambers, the weeping of those whose turn had come, the low murmurs of guards enforcing the schedule like clockmakers tending gears. The great halls themselves bore the marks of the system: silken partitions dividing space for multiple performances to run at once, seating arranged so that senators might watch their rivals endure fresh humiliation, and alcoves where the emperor could confer with his advisers while the night's degradations unfolded before them. These were not aimless orgies, they were administrative events, the mechanics of power laid bare in flesh and submission. The emperor understood that the system would collapse if his victims ever united against him. To prevent this, he weaponized shame. Every participant left the palace knowing that their degradation had been witnessed by others, not strangers but peers, rivals, and political enemies. To speak out was to confirm the rumors, to give those enemies the satisfaction of truth. Silence became the only shield, and in that silence the emperor's control deepened. Families destroyed in private maintained the outward appearance of dignity, their ruined honor hidden behind closed doors. Each household carried its own secret wound, never realizing that its neighbors bore the same. Even the economy began to orbit the palace's appetites. Merchants competed to supply the fabrics, oils, and foods deemed essential for the spectacles. Jewelers crafted chains and collars designed not for slaves, but for senators' daughters. Perfume makers developed scents used only within the inner chambers, fragrances that later clung to victims like invisible brands. The tradesmen knew the nature of their goods, but in an empire where the emperor's favor could double a fortune, morality had no market. As the system matured, the performances themselves grew darker. The emperor began to incorporate punishments into the spectacles, meting out discipline for imagined slights or inadequate enthusiasm. A wife who failed to please might be sent to serve in the palace brothel, her status stripped entirely, forced to entertain soldiers and foreign envoys. A senator who hesitated in delivering his daughter might be ordered to participate in the night's entertainment himself, his dignity dismantled in the same space where he once debated laws. These punishments were always carried out publicly, ensuring that the lesson was learned by all in attendance. By now, the palace was no longer simply a place of decadence. It was the empire's most effective instrument of control. The den of orgies had become a court in its own right, its judgments swift, its sentences binding, its rituals feared more than the executioner's axe. The emperor's genius lay in ensuring that no act of submission was ever final. Debts could be called in again and again. A family that had given a daughter 1 year might be asked for a wife the next, and a niece the year after. In this way, the cycle perpetuated itself, each generation inheriting the shame of the last. And at the center of it all sat the emperor, serene in the knowledge that he had turned the most sacred traditions of Rome, its religion, its politics, its families, into tools for his pleasure and his power. The palace's marble walls had once echoed with the voices of statesmen and generals. Now they carried the sounds of obedience made flesh. In his hands, the den of orgies was not simply a place, it was the empire itself, remade in his image. By the later years of his reign, the emperor's den of orgies had grown into something so vast. so entrenched that it seemed impossible to imagine Rome without it. The system ran with the precision of a military machine. Attendants assigned to scouting for new participants, scribes keeping meticulous lists of service days owed by noble families, architects modifying chambers to accommodate ever more elaborate performances. Yet for all its order, something in the emperor's hunger had shifted. What once had been calculated humiliation had curdled into pure cruelty. It was no longer enough for him to see the great houses of Rome bent in submission. Now he sought to push them beyond endurance, to strip away even the will to survive. The scale of the spectacles grew to monstrous proportions. Nights that once involved a few dozen participants now swelled to hundreds. Entire noble households would be summoned at once. Fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, cousins, all forced into the same great hall where the tiers of seating rose like an amphitheatre of shame. The emperor sat at the centre, his robes shimmering under torchlight, directing the proceedings with the detachment of a man reviewing a military parade. Performers were no longer chosen for beauty or novelty alone, but for the political impact their degradation would have. A senator who had dared to question a tax decree might find himself watching his wife paired with a foreign envoy. A general who failed to deliver victory in the provinces might be summoned to the dais and ordered to kneel before his own slave. The rituals themselves became layered with deliberate psychological torment. The emperor might call for a husband to embrace his wife tenderly, then instruct her to turn and offer herself to another man while her husband's arms were still around her. Parents were ordered to praise their children's obedience as they carried out acts designed to sear the mind. The cruelty lay not just in what was done, but in forcing those present to bear witness, their eyes unable to turn away under the emperor's gaze. In this theatre there were no bystanders. Everyone was either an actor in the performance or an audience whose silence was a form of complicity. Punishment for resistance became a spectacle of its own. A woman who dared refuse was dragged into the centre by guards, her garments torn away before the assembled court. She might be bound to a column and left there as the evening continued around her, or reassigned to the palace's lowest brothel, where soldiers could use her as they pleased. Men who tried to shield their families were made examples of, in even more brutal ways, stripped of their titles, paraded through the city streets in chains, and then returned to the palace to serve as participants in the very rituals they had tried to avoid. Each punishment was a performance, the message clear. No one was beyond the emperor's reach. The religious aspect of the den reached its most blasphemous form during this period. Festivals once meant to honour Rome's gods became sprawling orgiastic ceremonies, lasting not hours but days. Offerings to the divine were made in the form of living bodies, brought forward to enact scenes the emperor claimed were sacred reenactments of mythical unions. Priestesses from the most venerable temples were compelled to participate, their purity recast as a gift to the emperor god. The great hall was draped in crimson and gold, altars replaced with cushioned platforms, hymns drowned out by the rhythm of drums that drove the night's events. To refuse was no longer simply treason. It was heresy punishable by death, carried out without trial. The atmosphere in Rome shifted. In the early years, fear had been mixed with awe, a grudging fascination with the spectacle's scale. But as the demands became impossible to ignore, dread began to seep into every layer of society. Families lived in constant anxiety, knowing the summons could come at any hour. Wealth provided no refuge. In fact, the richer the household, the more likely they were to be called upon to furnish offerings. The emperor's appetite was no respecter of age. The very young and the old alike could be summoned if it suited his mood or served some political point. And yet, despite the horror, there was no open revolt. The shame was too deep, the victims too isolated from one another. Each believed their suffering was unique, a secret too terrible to share, not realizing that nearly every household in Rome bore the same wound. The emperor relied on this silence, feeding it with threats, bribes, and the ever-present knowledge that those who spoke out rarely lived to regret it. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The same Praetorian guards who had once enforced the emperor's will without hesitation began to shift uneasily during the most depraved spectacles. They had seen their own sisters, wives, and daughters brought into the chamber. They had been ordered to hold down men they had served beside in battle. Each act eroded the loyalty that bound them to their master. Senators who had long since abandoned thoughts of dignity began to think of survival in a different way, not as continued compliance, but as the removal of the man who had turned their world into a cage. The emperor, blinded by the scale of his power, seemed unaware of the danger. In his mind, the den of Orgies had become the empire's true center, more important than the Senate, the legions, even the treasury. He spoke openly of making the rituals a formal requirement for all citizens, envisioning a future where every man, woman, and child would offer themselves in service at least once in their lives. The idea was greeted with applause in the hall, but outside it landed like a death knell. For the first time, the humiliation that had been the burden of the elite threatened to become the common lot of all Rome. It was this ambition to universalize the den, to make the degradation of the body an official duty of citizenship, that began to unite the silent sufferers. Whispers passed through the corridors of power, exchanged in coded phrases between men who had not dared meet each other's eyes for years. The guards who escorted victims to the inner circle began to memorize the faces of those who winced, those whose hands clenched into fists at the emperor's commands. In private, small knots of conspirators began to form, bound not by ideology or loyalty to the old ways, but by a shared desperation to end the reign of the man who had remade the heart of Rome into a monument of shame. The emperor, meanwhile, continued as though nothing could touch him. He expanded the inner chambers yet again, commissioning marble reliefs that depicted the most infamous of his rituals for posterity. He planned ceremonies that would eclipse even his wildest past displays, nights where every great family would be represented and every participant would be marked publicly as having served the emperor's pleasure. The invitations were already being prepared when the first conspirators swore their oath. The breaking point had been reached, though the man at the center of it still believed he was untouchable. The plot took shape in the same silent corridors where the emperor's commands had once passed like decrees from a god. It began with the Praetorian Guard, men who had seen too much, who had been forced to lay hands on their own kin in service to the den. They did not meet in taverns or senate chambers. Their plans were whispered in passing, hidden in the formal language of military duty. Senators, long stripped of dignity, found themselves willing to join forces with the very guards they once feared. Each man had his own reason: a wife broken, a child taken, a family name stained beyond repair. But together they shared a single goal: to end the reign of the man who had made Rome a theatre of shame. The emperor, oblivious, was already planning his grandest spectacle yet. A gathering meant to unite every noble house in one night of devotion. It would be the ultimate declaration of his absolute power. Instead, it became the night of his undoing. Beneath the marble floors and silken banners, steel was being sharpened, alliances sealed in glances, and the first steps taken toward ending the reign of the man who believed himself untouchable. They found him in the dim passage beneath the palace, a place meant for his private escape, not his death. Steel struck quickly, and the man who had commanded every body in Rome collapsed without ceremony. Above, the den fell silent, its music and laughter extinguished in an instant. The torches smoked in the sudden stillness, casting uneasy shadows across the marble floors that had witnessed years of humiliation. In the days that followed, the new order sealed the chambers, draped the walls, and spoke of rebuilding. But the air of the palace never cleared. It still carried the memory of him,